My name is Taylor, and today we have another very exciting page doing episode. As I say every time, they all are, but this one is no exception. We are joined here by what I would like to call a jack of all trades of the bookish community, Adam Bassett. Thank you so much for joining us today. If people don't know who you are or what you do in the bookish space, would you mind giving us just a little bit of a self-introduction?
Yeah, of course. Thank you again for having me. I appreciate it. So I am doing a lot of things. It's hard to know what to start with. The day job is I'm working as a designer over at Campfire, where I help make software for people who are writing, and we have a reading app now for people who just want to come and chill and read books. I'm also the author of Digital Extremities. Is in this pile over here. Just came out a few weeks ago. So that's a real thing that I'm holding now, which is weird. So that's a collection of short stories. It's like low tech cyberpunk kind of. People have been comparing it to kind of like a not quite as insane Black Mirror in some ways, which would have been a really good pitch if I thought of it before the readers did. um, so I've been busy with that. I've got a couple of other projects in the works as well. I've been working on a novella that I just finished up a little bit earlier this week, and I'm going through an editing right now. And I'm working on a nonfiction book all about map design and sort of how you can use different aspects of that within your story to help tell that story. So it's kind of a mix, a weird hybrid of like visual design concepts with general world building advice, which I haven't seen before and has been really fun to work on. And that's kind of in part because I also do map design on the side. I work with some authors and game masters and just hobbyists who are interested in having a map of their world for various reasons. I really enjoy making like survey maps. So the kind of maps you'd see in like the 1800s when explorers would like go down the rivers and lakes and all these places, and you'd see like really detailed maps of those shorelines, and then everything beyond that is kind of a mystery, or it's just extremely wrong. Like those old maps of where California is an island because people thought for a very long time that it was an island. um, so yeah, that's kind of the collection of stuff I have going on at the moment. So the big exciting thing is the book, but we've got a lot in the works.
Quite a plethora of things. And we'll be getting to all of them in turn, don't worry. But I did just want to start a bit general, because since you're doing all of this, Campfire, the web design that you do for them, as well as any of the other stuff that you're doing within that company, you're an author, you're on Fan Fi Addict, you are
Yeah,
a
I do
fantasy
book reviews
cartographer.
sometimes too. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and also, part of what you do, from what I've seen on Campfire as well, is you do written interviews. So there's just a lot of things that you're doing. And as someone else who's kind of got their fingers in a lot of baskets, if that's not a phrase, but you know what I mean, right now. I guess a lot of pies is the phrase, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I understand that balancing those things can be quite difficult. So I'm wondering for you, how are you kind of working through and balancing all of these different things you do in the community? Or are you balancing them?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on the day, if I'm being honest. But realistically, I think that the biggest thing that's helped me is both having deadlines for myself. Whatever form that takes. Sometimes they're self-imposed. Sometimes it's like, this actually does need to get done at a certain time. And also, being able to forgive myself if I don't hit them, because realistically, we set out with a plan a lot of the time, and sometimes we don't hit it. And in a lot of cases, for my situation at the moment, that's kind of okay. There are of course, some things with my job with Campfire that I can't sort of let slide like that. So there's like a level of prioritization, of course. But if the book is delayed by 2 weeks, or if I don't have the final draft of a thing ready to go when I thought I would, if an artist takes an extra week, if an editor takes an extra week, if there's a delay on like a map design or something, if I don't read and review as many books as I want this year, that's okay. And just sort of allowing myself to fail has actually been a really good way of helping me succeed, because I'm not stressed as much as I used to be. I think it was like last year I moved across the country, and that was kind of in itself a very stressful thing. And I wanted to be writing. I wanted to get into publishing a little more. I was working on this novel, and it was like, the big thing that I was doing. It was going to be kind of my return to this space, basically. And every time I worked on it, I kind of began to hate it a little bit more, because it just wasn't quite turning into what I wanted it to be. And for a lot of reasons. Part of it was, again, just that stress. Part of it was, I couldn't quite find where I wanted the characters to go, and a lot of different things. So kind of once I allowed myself to put that to the side, other stuff became a lot easier. And I do want to go back to it at some point, but right now there are some other projects that are moving a lot easier for me. So I'm going to work on those for now. So yeah, I think that's kind of like a long-winded answer of just like, allowing myself to fail and giving myself deadlines, and kind of in general, just having flexibility. One thing that's nice about my job is we all work remote and can kind of set our own hours, so long as everything that needs to happen happens. So long as, when we meet every other week at like specific times, I'm there. But aside from that, like, if I want to write in the morning, I can. If I want to work in the morning or night, I can. Like, it's really whatever works.
Mm-mm. Just so you know, we live for the long-winded answers here. This is long-form content. You're in the right space for that. I know, Peel, as a fellow creative, you probably feel some of what Adam said about the current project not working so well and working through some of the kinks. As an author yourself, I imagine you've gone through some of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I love what Adam said about, it's okay sometimes to meet those deadlines, because the beauty, especially being a self-published author, is that those deadlines are pretty well self-imposed, right? Like, you don't have a publisher that's like, you've signed contractually, like, this shall be finished by this date, and you have to go ask an editor for an extension or whatever.
Yeah, there's a weird balance between like having deadlines so that you actually do something, and not getting so focused on them that you get so stressed out and you can't meet them anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel that deeply as well. All of us working in the creative space, sometimes things take a bit longer than you'd expected, but deadlines are there for a reason, right? So it's a hard balance. So I was just curious, as someone who's balancing so much. So thank you for that. But I would like to focus a little bit on, not a little bit, a lot of it, on Digital Extremities at the beginning here before we get into everything else. So my understanding of it, and from what I've seen you say in some other interviews, is it's a balance between, it's a cyberpunk story, but it strikes a balance between the rural and the more nature-based aspect of it, as well as the futuristic aspect. And you were trying to balance those two things. And something you said about, cartography as well earlier, is how that aspect, that physical aspect of the map you're making, can affect your story. So I'm curious, as someone who has such a strong grasp of that concept of environment and what's around you affecting the story itself, why did you decide to set Digital Extremities in such a contrasting, like dichotomous environment? What was it that drew you to that environment for your short stories?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is that it's interesting. At the end of the day, that's kind of the thing that matters the most when it comes to storytelling. But I mean, there are a lot of little reasons why it made sense to me. One of the more obvious ones for me personally is that I've grown up in places that are rural areas, kind of. We were talking before the show a little bit how like I grew up in northern New York, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But the Adirondacks are kind of my backyard. And so these, giant old mountains and big dense forests and places like that. Um, and I'd never seen cyberpunk in that kind of space. And I was really curious in general, just what does that look like? So that was a big reason behind why to set it there. But also, like, cyberpunk has always been uh, concerned with the environment in some way, whether it's talking about environmental decline, like kind of through a lens of global warming, or through a lens of like uh, corporate greed has been historically a big part of it. And so, like, there's a lot of play, I think, between technological advancement and cyberpunk and sci-fi, and the way that impacts or is impacted by nature. And that doesn't always matter to the individual stories, but it helps to set up a really interesting space where they can exist.
That makes a lot of sense, I think, because it's quite obvious if it's set in the future. There's a lot of environmentalism involved in this.
Mm.
That time elapsing would allow those two forces to kind of interchange in a way that you can extrapolate on, right? So we're not quite sure what the future would look like, but if this time has passed and these are the environmental factors that we're working with, it makes sense that you would want to be close to that natural environment to see how those two would interact together.
Yeah, and it allows you to do some more subtle parts of world building. So, like, the collection begins at the end of this century and ends in the middle of the next century. That progression isn't hugely important, but there is a clear change of like it's lower tech in the beginning, and then there's kind of a transitional period, and then by the very end, it looks a lot like a typical cyberpunk story. With all the neon and the robotic parts and literal robots and like all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an element of that, and one of my favorite parts of like how the environment plays into that is through what people have for drinking water. Because in the very beginning, people are just drinking water, and then by the middle, you start hearing about this like bougie, pure Antarctic drinking water that people are having like bottled up and exported all around the world, because there's there is like a political and scientific angle to all of this, where there's I forget the exact name, but there's a treaty which is going to expire in about 50 years, which says right now Antarctica cannot be used for, it can't be mined, it can't be used for resources, you can't get anything from it. It can only be used for like scientific purposes. But that's going to expire. And I think as resources become scarce worldwide, it's not unreasonable to think there's a lot of natural resources in the continent, whether it be like oil or ice or whatever it may be. So in the background of all the stories that are happening, you get this kind of through line of people beginning to drink melted Antarctic ice because it's hip and cool, and toward the end, that is just the source of water. Which is like not a major thing, but it's those little touches, those little like notes of like how the city got built, the different food and water sources they have, down to like those are the things that I think help to make it feel more lived in. And being in more rural and remote places, you do, I think, in some ways put a bigger emphasis on all those details because they're maybe more scarce or they matter more to those people, or matter in different ways.
I love me an anthology that has a connected theme across it. That is my jam. So you just spoke some magic words to me. Yeah, the short story collections are wonderful for their flexibility, but I love when there's an overarching kind of thread that you can follow. So that sounds very intriguing that you have this kind of timeline that is hinted at throughout it, even though it's not overt. But I could see people drinking the bougie. It's the new Fuji water, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're doing it today. It's just called by a different name.
I can absolutely imagine that. I can see the label even, you know?
Yeah, I've had a bunch of people reach out to me who say like, friends who read it or something, or like family members. A couple of people who like, I'm just looking for reviews, and so I'd offer a code to somebody who like maybe doesn't typically read sci-fi. And a lot of those people, when they come back and talk to me about it, a lot of them are like, I don't normally read this, but it was like surprisingly accessible. Like it felt kind of just like an extension of contemporary life in kind of an unsettling way sometimes.
Mm.
And a few of them have said like, I want to read more cyberpunk now. I want to read more sci-fi, which has been like a really cool, like that's somewhat intentional because I do think cyberpunk, especially like low tech cyberpunk, is really well positioned to help bring new people into the genre. But it's been really gratifying to like chat with those people and hear their thoughts on like their very first cyberpunk novel. It's like, oh, that's mine.
That's an absolutely perfect segue to my next question, which was that you had said that you had wanted to make it accessible, right? This was a purposeful decision on your part. So this is kind of a two-part question. The first would be, why did you decide to do that from the outset? And two, what are some of the writing things that you did in order to make that happen? Because clearly it's working, right? There are people who are now hooked on cyberpunk because of your story, right?
Yeah.
So what did you do to be able to get that result?
To answer the first question as to why, I think part of that is just like my profession coming through. Because when we talk about like UX, UI, web design kind of stuff, a huge part of that is accessibility. I don't like, whenever I'm designing something, I'm trying to think about, the least educated user, the person who's never published a book before, who's never used writing software like this before, who's never used a reading app before. Maybe it's like their first time picking up an ebook. So like for all of those different situations, we need to consider, is the iconography working? Does does the flow make sense for how they navigate through these pages? Can we reduce the amount of information so that there's less to digest? Can we reduce the number of steps to get from point A to point B? And of course, like the inverse is true as well, where we have to concern ourselves with the people who have done this a million times and who are used to doing things certain ways. Somebody who's published 20 books over on Amazon, they're going to come over to Campfire and they're going to expect a similar experience to uploading their EPUB and adding all their information and hitting a publish button. Of course, there are always things that kind of get thrown into the middle of that, which we have to account for. And there's always the question of like, can we make this better in some way, make it make more sense, whatever the case may be. So as far as accessibility comes, that's just kind of a thing that I'm always thinking about in some way. And like I said, with this collection, I think there was just kind of a natural opportunity for me to do something with that because, like I said, this is on the lower side of like advanced technology. And when we're dealing with low tech, we're not necessarily going to have an entirely new vocabulary for all of the things that we're trying to describe. So, I could call the little like ports on the side of a person's head with all the like cyberpunky bits and knobs and ports that you put something in, and like you put a hard wire into a computer and jack in and download all the secrets and everything. And like I could pull from Neuromancer, I could pull from Cyberpunk 2077. There is an established language for that, but a lot of people don't know it. I could invent my own language that I think makes more sense, but even fewer people know all those terms. And so a big part of how I thought about making this accessible was basically by like removing a lot of the technobabble. And when I had to name something, name it something that made sense. Like, this thing on the side of the head is just a cochlear implant. It's a thing that goes around your ear. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that, especially for the sake of these stories where, the things that they do are like, basically hands-free phones, or like contact lenses that give you a heads-up display. And we already know what a heads-up display is. We can use it for a lot of different things, but like it doesn't have to get more complicated. And so definitely like trying to think of things in a way where it would be natural for a modern audience who might be less familiar with some stuff. And of course, like, slow, because the collection advances through time. I just looked over. I realized my good mic is not on. We've been going through my bad mic.
Oh no, it's fine.
I don't
It
know
sounds fine to me.
if I turn this on, does the sound change at all? Testing 1 2 check at all. Does
Sounds
this
about the same to me.
Okay, it's probably we're just gonna put that aside.
Okay. It's fine.
It's just gonna be what it is, I think.
I didn't notice anything, if it makes you feel better.
It's all good. If you didn't say anything, it's probably fine. But yeah,
So it has-
the short version of all that is like trying to communicate things in a language that makes sense, and because things advance over time throughout the stories, I can sort of slowly introduce some concepts that I know are going to be coming up later, and like show them in an earlier form, or like ease into it so that later I don't have to fully describe what the concept is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. And connecting it with your jobs there, because as people who are so entrenched in this fantasy or sci-fi world, I feel like sometimes we forget that there's jargon that people outside of this community do not know and don't necessarily care to know.
Yep.
So I think that second part is quite important. So I love the fact that you focused on language as an accessibility point for people, because not only does that allow other people to enter the space, but if you are more practiced in it, you can recognize that as, oh, this is a call back to or a reference to this other thing that I know, right? So I feel like it could work for both sides. So
yeah, I haven't had anyone tell me so far that it was like dumbed down or anything. I'm sure someone will one day. But
well, that comes with getting a wider audience, right?
Yeah. I'm not
part of
concerned
it,
about
right? Yeah. That makes a lot of sense for me. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that, Digital Extremities is one of the main points that we wanted to talk about today, and we might circle back around to it.
Mm.
But because we've mentioned it quite a few times now, I think it would be good to talk a little bit about Campfire.
Okay.
So it's been mentioned here and there, but if you look at Campfire's website or their Twitter, the catchphrase is a platform made for reading, writing, and publishing books. That tells me a lot, and at the same time doesn't really tell me that much about exactly what Campfire is. And I think that that would be purposeful, right? I imagine that that's something that was there for a reason to keep it broad like that. So since we're lucky enough to have someone here who knows the inside info, could you tell us a little bit more about what exactly Campfire does as a platform and what people can be looking for from that space?
Yeah, I think the difficult part of it is that it is so many things. So when we describe it in like short sentences like that, it's tough to kind of consolidate that down to something simple. So Campfire is kind of like 3 different pieces. The main 2 are the writing platform, which if you're an author and you're trying to organize your thoughts, you can come to Campfire and you can work on just your world building and organize all that into like neat parts. We've got like 18 different writing modules where you can do everything from write your book to create a fantasy calendar to draft out a timeline or create a whole cast of characters with like full profiles and everything. So there's a lot there that you can sort of use whichever of those tools in the toolbox that work for you and your project. We even have tools to hide ones that you're not using because we don't expect people to use everything for every single project. That just doesn't make sense. But personally, right now, I've been using it to work on the novella that I mentioned at the beginning, and I've really only used one of those tools. But yeah, so that's one side of it, is the whole writing platform. And then we also have the reading platform now, where you can come, and we have a free reading app that you can go download called Campfire. That's on iOS and Android devices. Um, and you can go ahead and just start like reading books from there. Some of them are free, some are paid. It depends on what the author did. We got a lot of indie science fiction, and fantasy is kind of the centerpiece of it all. There's been a lot of cozy fantasy, especially lately. It's still a small storefront. It's we've just launched it. I believe late last year or early this year, depending on how you look at it. And so it's still growing. We're still working on it, still making improvements. I was just checking out a update that we're planning to launch, I think next week, which has like a couple of quality life changes and stuff. So we're still tweaking things and supporting authors in whatever ways we can. That's part of the neat part of it all, is because we have that writing side to help prop us up. It's not just the reading platform. And so we can sort of use those to help each other out. So if you're reading on Campfire, what the author can do is set up extra bonus content to reveal at certain times. So let's say you meet a new character at chapter 3, and that person has set up a character profile for that new person. You wouldn't want to show that to the audience before they hit chapter 3. So what you can do is say, when the reader finishes chapter 3, they unlock this character profile, and now they can go and learn more about that person they just met. Same thing, like I've had some authors do similar things with maps. So they'll have like multiple versions of their main map that show like different annotations by the characters in the story. And so as you progress through the story, you can see the notes that they're making on the maps as they go. Different things like that. Some authors don't use them. Another one, I think one coming out soon by Eliza Leone, I saw her talking about her cozy fantasy, the third book in the series. I think it's got like 60 plus bonus content pieces, which is like character profiles and behind the scenes info. And I think there's like a magic system in there somewhere. Like it's all kinds of stuff. So they can kind of make it whatever they want it to be. And as the reader, you just, when you find a book that you enjoy, sometimes you just get more book with it, which is nice. And yeah, so like that's
his eyes are like sparkling. We're like, well, that's so cool.
Yeah. 80% royalties.
So just a summary of that would be like, let's say PL did go for one of his many novels he's written in his life. If he did take one of those and bring it over to Campfire, he would have a big toolkit that he could choose what he wanted, what would match for his style, and then add those extras to his book through your platform if he chose to.
Yeah, you publish everything right through the platform. The book itself is through an EPUB, so very similar to how you're used to doing it. And then if you want to include extra bonus material, you can go through and use any of the modules that you like, or none of them, sort of whatever works for your project. So we don't restrict anything based on that. So yeah.
That sounds so fascinating, just from a reader's perspective. I know, PL, maybe I can pass this to you and you can take it from a writer's perspective. But from a reader's perspective, that sounds like so much fun.
Yeah.
Like getting to dive
it is.
deeper.
It's definitely an interesting experience to be reading through something, and then like you hit the end of a chapter and there's like, we've got like custom, this is actually one of my jobs, which is super fun. I got to design like custom button frames. So the author can go and like, whenever you've unlocked 2 extras or something, you could choose like the fantasy frame, which is like 2 dragons coming in from the sides around the button. There's like there's another one for dark fantasy, which is like a couple of swords coming in toward it with like lightning all around it. There's just like a bunch of different like customization options and stuff that are fun.
Sounds like you're gamifying reading in the best way. I mean that as a compliment.
Genuinely, like so within UX UI, gamifying something is a real mixed bag. It's one of those like keywords where the corporate office is like, let's gamify the thing where people spend money. Isn't that great? Like, so I went into it with very, very skeptical. And then I started talking with a bunch of different authors. I will very often, when I get time, chat with our community or people outside of it and try to get like their opinions on different things, whether it be like in this case, it was just like the concept of like, is this idea interesting? Other times I'll come with like a full design ready to like present and see how they interact with it. In this case, I reached out to people and I was like, hey, you know, we're thinking about doing this thing where you get to like hide bonus content until you hit a certain chapter and then you get to reveal it and like go see it. And every single person I spoke to was like, that sounds amazing. So I was like, all right, I guess we're doing this.
You can add 2 more people to that list, clearly.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm totally geeking out here over this. This is like, I think it's like every writer's dream, because I know for a lot of, especially the fantasy sphere and the sci-fi sphere, we can world build for the rest of our lives and not actually sometimes write the book. Like we could create, you know, subplots and sub-characters and backstories and all these things, and, you know, give our world, you know, all of this data, you know, geography and population and all these stats, and, you know, and you can really get lost in that. Like you could literally just keep perpetuating that and go down all these rabbit holes. But just to be able to offer that as like a bonus feature for the readers, like that is just incredible. Like I mean, even just conceptually, I'm thinking about it. It's like, you know, it's almost like the way a lot of us go down the rabbit hole of wikis. You know, you can go on a Song of Ice and Fire wiki and you can learn so much about the universe that, you know, you literally get lost doing it, right?
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And yeah, it just sounds incredible. I guess my question is, what went into the concept of this? Why was this created? What did you guys all get together and just say, hey, you know what, this would be really, like, what went into the making of this?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it was, you know, Campfire's origins as we were a writing software before we were anything else. And before, like, you know, you go back far enough, back in like 2018, 2019, before I joined, we didn't even have a way to write a book. It was just world building, plotting, organization, all those kinds of tools. And then we added all the rest of the stuff later. So I think part of it comes back to our origin sort of as a planning, world building, organization, note taking software, where, you know, Campfire is the place where you can go to write down all that world building. And like you said, a lot of it doesn't really see the light of day. It's like notes for yourself so you don't forget something, or just because you were having fun with a concept or whatever the case may be. And now, because we have this whole publishing platform, it's like, well, we don't want to like use only one part of Campfire. Like we have all this extra unique stuff that just doesn't really exist on you know, your Barnes and Noble, your Amazon, all these other places. So it's like, how can we use that in an interesting way, which is like not going to confuse people, but still like give readers something to enjoy. Maybe like help authors even like, you know, you can give it away or you can monetize all those extra things as well. So like, you know, toss the author an extra $3 and you get access to a whole bunch of extra stuff. So that was kind of the idea of like, how do we provide, you know, use what we already have, provide something interesting for readers, and give writers something to help them just sort of like market, sell their work and all that kind of stuff. Because there is like a different kind of message between I have this book, check it out, versus I have this book and it's got 50 extra things with it. So that was kind of the original concept, and it took some time to figure out exactly how we get from there to where we are today, where there's like this whole unlocking thing. We looked at a lot of different comparable, you know, productivity tools that had some kind of like goal setting to it. We looked at, you know, a bunch of different video games that have like different progression tracks. We looked at things kind of in the middle, like Duolingo, which, you know, have their different milestone rewards and everything. And ended up coming away with this system, which at the end of the day, I think is fairly simple. It is just kind of read the book and you'll get stuff. We've had different versions of it in the past in like different iterations before it was fully put out there, where there were like more moving parts and potentially like animations and stuff. But we ended up like stripping a lot of that away, both for our own sake, because we're a small development team, but also just like, if you're reading a book, you don't necessarily want a bunch of moving things in front of you. You want to be reading the book. And you can go somewhere else and look at other stuff if you want, but you don't want to be feeling like you're being dragged away from the book if you're really enjoying it. So definitely like trying to strike a balance there was a big goal for us, to like have these things, give you access to them really easily, but not do so in a way that's going to distract or annoy people.
When you said Duolingo, I just remembered that little bird, how he gets like sicker if you don't go into the app.
Yeah, we don't do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, that's what it reminded me of, and I can see why you guys decided to strip some of that away and just make it an internal thing.
Yeah, like, you know, things like Duolingo, they work really well because Duolingo is trying to get you to engage with the app as much as possible. We don't necessarily, like, obviously, you know, come back and finish the book you're reading, but we know people are going to come and go based on what book they're reading at the time, what things they're finding, you know, the time they have available in the moment. And like, you know, again, if you're reading a book, you don't want a little bird yelling at you. So,
right.
you know, some of those more extreme versions got stripped away very quickly.
Well, I think that's the importance of having the people who are making the product involved in enjoying the product, right? You guys know what it's like to enjoy reading, to enjoy writing. So you can come at it from that perspective, not just a marketing perspective. And that's something else that I wanted to bring up about what I've heard you say about Campfire. Is one of the focuses is to be author focused, to be on the side of authors. And that also, I believe, will be a very strong point to the platform, because not only are you all readers, but a lot of you are authors as well. So I wanted to ask you to just elaborate a little bit more on that, what it looks like being on the side of authors for this particular platform.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in general, just when we come to a fork in the road, we need to make a decision on something, we generally try to think about how does this impact the people using the platform. That's not always the authors. A lot of the times it is, but sometimes it's the readers. Sometimes it's people who are just coming to our blog to learn about a thing. And so it is about the authors, but it's about the authors because we are focused on the users in general. You know, sort of, and that the person we're talking about changes depending on what part of the site you look at. So, for example, you know, the writing tools, you get a lot for free, so you can try everything out, no paywalls. There are like limits on how much you can make because we do need to pay rent. But you know, aside from that, you're never going to hit a point where it's like, hey, this feature is blocked by you not having the subscription to this thing. Like, we just don't do that because we think it's really important for people to be able to try something out before they buy it. You know, when it comes to publishing, authors get 80% royalties, and you know, we are trying to, you know, that's just one way that we're trying to be really pro-author in terms of that side of things. We don't restrict where people can publish, like Kindle Unlimited does. You know, you can take your stuff off Campfire at any time, whenever that suits you, sort of for whatever reason. And you know, on the reader side, it's a lot of how do we make this experience feel really good? How do we improve performance? How do we you know, keep things fairly simple and still like add those little flares of, you know, the dragons approaching the unlock button and all those little things. So you know, there's always a balance to be struck. And I think that more times than not, wherever is possible, we do break in the side of, the version of whatever decision this is going to be that's going to help the people who are using our platform the most.
Right. That reminds me a lot of the way that a lot of people in this community approach just being in this space, because we care about it. It's not coming from the outside in, it's because we're in it. So that's beautiful. We'd love to hear it. So I want to kind of go a little bit more into what you specifically do. So not only do you do UI or UX, which for someone who's like me who had to Google what those are, it's user interface and user experience, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you do the tech side there, but also you do outreach by doing interviews with authors, right?
Yeah. I've found very quickly that if I only did design work, I would drive myself insane. And so I needed little outlets to do stuff. They've been different things at different times. I used to be the voice behind our YouTube channel. I have done like more detailed blogs. We've actually got a little series about map design coming out right now, which has been fun to work on. But the kind of the more constant thing of this has been interviews. Those are fairly easy for me to do once I have somebody who's agreed to it. I do it all over emails. And so the interviewee can respond as they get time. It's very low pressure. And I get a chance I'll spend like 2 or 3 questions at a time. So I get to see their response and I get to respond to what they're saying, sort of like you and I are doing here. So, one thing that I'm not a huge fan of, but I understand why people do this, is like, they'll send off 10 questions and then you answer the 10 questions and it's done. You never get a chance to have a conversation with the person. And that's something that I try to avoid doing, is like, when they say something interesting, I want to be able to respond to it. And that might mean it takes a little bit of time, but it's, at the end of the day, it would take me about the same amount of time to do all the research I need to do to ask, 8 or 10 interesting questions and then wait for the responses, versus I can like do a little bit less research, if I'm being honest, and then send like 3 interesting questions and then they say something interesting back and it's like, oh, let's just talk about that for a little bit. Like, that sounds really interesting.
As fellow interviewers, we get it, right?
Yeah. And with everything else I have going on, I have to, be smart about how I spend my time a little bit. So where I can, and I don't think that changes the quality of the interview at all. Because like, we just posted one that I did with Emma Wong, and I did not expect that to go the way that it did. I just realized like, a lot of their work was originally going to be a novella, and then it became something much bigger. And I asked about that. And they just sort of went off on a tangent about how, like, they really didn't, like, they had no plans of going back to the sort of Kaigen, and they did not like the setting for Blood Over Brighthaven. And it's just like, oh, this is all really fascinating stuff. Like, let's just linger here for a bit.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what makes an interview enjoyable, like what we're doing here, is just talking about what everyone here finds interesting, right? Instead of following a predetermined path. So I see why I agree with you. I see why people would send things off, is based on time constraints and things like that. But the way that you're doing it sounds really, really intriguing. And it would add a lot of joy to the interview process as well, being able to have that interaction.
Yeah, it's a fun thing for me to do on the side, where I just get to, like, I've met and spoken with so many incredible authors that I never would have imagined that I would have otherwise. And that's just been, like, in itself a really rewarding thing on the side that I get to play around with a little bit. And of course, like, it helps our blog out because you can go through there, and I think we've published like roughly 80 different posts with people like Ed Greenwood and Brian McClellan and Emma Wong and just like a ton of really talented people.
Yeah, something that PL and I often say, and I'm sure we will continue to say, is through doing this, you realize that just asking, you'd be surprised who says yes.
Yeah, I had a friend back when I was like working at the local movie theater must have been like 10 years ago or something. I
Did
was
we
just
live
on a,
the same life? That was my first job. Like, what's going
it
on?
wasn't my first. I worked at a local park first.
Oh, there we go.
But that
Okay.
was my first one after college.
Mm-mm.
But anyway, I was working at the theater, and a friend of mine who I hung out with sometimes when we were working together, he started a little podcast on the side. And I think it was like his second episode. He had this singer from OK Go on.
What?
I was like, what?
What is this? This
He's like, yeah, I
witchcraft?
just emailed him and I asked if he would come on, and he was like, sure.
Yeah,
Like, oh, okay, I don't know you could do that.
yeah. It's pretty
So,
amazing.
so like
Yeah.
my motto whenever I think like, oh, I can't get this person to talk with me, my motto is basically like back to 10 years ago in that little movie theater job where my friend was talking with OK Go.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's really nice to have a memory like that to recall back to if you have a moment where you feel, all right, can I really do this? It's like, well, actually, yeah, you probably can. So yeah, that's wonderful to hear. And something else that has come up a lot, so I'd like to delve a little bit into it here, is your fantasy cartography. So something that I've heard, yeah, Beals ready to go. Something that I've heard mentioned a few times just throughout you talking about it, and also in regards to Digital Extremities, the way you talked about the environment there, is the blending of the real with the fantasy. So also on your website, you have a couple sample maps. And in all of those descriptions you describe. Clearly, I needed the thesaurus, but in all of those descriptions, you say that this is the real world map that I referenced when I was working on this. And then you talk a little bit more about the fantasy aspect of it. So I'm curious for you, what does that process look like, the blending of the real and the fantasy?
I think just as humans, we understand the world through the perspective of the one that we live in. Or I guess we understand fiction through the perspective of Earth. So, like, we can make stuff up, but even if it's, we are trying to make stuff up, it's usually informed by our experiences, by what we understand already. Um, so I don't really see a point in beating around the bush, if I'm being honest. So like if somebody wants to work on a map, like I had a commission from Robin Dabney. She's the author of the Ascendature, the first in I think a trilogy that she's planning. She gave me a map which was like very quick sketch just to get me started basically. And she gave me like a couple of details about it. And one of the things that stuck out to me was like basically, if this screen is the page, the coastlines went like this. It was very like lines in a box at 90-degree angles. And for her purposes, that was fine because she didn't need anything very detailed for the story she was writing. She just needed to know like the general distance between things. And like, when you're at that point in writing or, you don't need a detailed map, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, I encourage people to like grab a sticky note and just jot down the broad strokes of your world, put down like the points of the major cities. Like that is an incredibly valuable resource to have. But when it comes time to like publish the book and you want a map included in it, those kinds of shapes just don't look natural. So one of the things that we talked about, I always ask people, especially if I'm working with somebody else about this, I always ask, do you want me to screw around with this? Is it supposed to look exactly this way? Because I can make what you gave me, but there are usually like one or two things that I can see where it's like we can make this a little more interesting. And she graciously allowed me to play with it. And one of my first questions after that was like, what is this story based on? What is the location based on? And her answers were like Pacific Northwest in the like Americas, and a lot of her inspiration for like some of the mountains came from like the Alps and like parts of Europe. So those were kind of the places I was thinking about when I was making it. And so the example of the coastlines that I was talking about, For a lot of those, I was looking at parts of the Pacific Northwest and parts of Europe, and just for fun, I would like throw in little bits of other places like Japan or something, just to mix it up a little bit. Because so much of a coastline is variation. You have some periods where it's like very rocky and jagged, and you have some parts where it's very linear. Um, and so trying to make it look natural through the lens of, what does the original sketch look like? And what is the story, the place based on, so that I can make the place in like the fictional place somewhat resemble the real place that like it would make sense for these kinds of land masses to exist in. So yeah, the coastline became a lot rockier. It became a lot more jagged. Like where there were sections where there was no story, I got to play a lot more. So I would I think at one point I added a whole inland sea somewhere and like made up a whole story about it. And she was just like, okay. um, and yeah, so like she just sort of let me play with it a little bit. And but all those choices were based on decisions that she made while writing the story, and sort of imagining the world to begin with. So yeah, that was a fun project. I think that's a good example of like, how the real world informs it. And of course, like um, the style of the map can change a lot depending on the time period. So an older map looks a lot different than like a modern digital map versus one from like you go back far enough, you start seeing TNO maps from like the Middle Ages, which is like there's a block here for Europe, a block here for Asia, and a bigger block down here for Africa, and it does not look real at all. But that is the way they envisioned the world. Yeah, it's there's a lot of different things you can consider.
Well, something that really strikes me from that description is history. That history seems to have a really big impact on how you would approach the way the map looks, the way different land masses might move or shift or be a different shape depending on the space that they're in, and how history can affect that. And I know, PL, you're a history buff as well. So I imagine whenever you guys are thinking about your map, PL, I don't want to presume that I know how you went about making your map, but I've read your book, so I've seen your map. But when you go through making those kinds of things, talk about rabbit holes. Do you ever go down like a history rabbit hole? Trying to figure something like that out?
I mean, it depends a lot. Like if I'm working on a map for myself, I can go much deeper down a rabbit hole, or just choose not to worry about it. Like, it's whatever I'm feeling at the time. But if I'm working with somebody else, it is at times helpful to know, like, how far back have you considered this? Like, there's a mountain range here. How long has it been forming? Because the way mountain ranges forms, it's like two plates colliding and forcing land up. And so has this been going on for a long time? Is it a newer mountain range, or is it one that's very old and has like weathered away? That might impact the way that the mountains get drawn. If it's a map that has mountains, because there are some like road maps you don't show them, outside of like a little icon for the biggest one.
Did you freeze? Oh no, okay. I thought you did. For some reason, there was no movement. I think I froze for a second there. Yeah. So I think that having that thought process probably makes building a map so much more fun, because not only do you have the final result, but you have the processes that would have happened to make it the way that it is, and it gives a lot of depth to world building, I imagine. Especially even if it's not your story, you now have an in-depth view of what this person's story is and how it's set. And I just have to ask, it's a little slight tangent, but very connected. In one interview, you mentioned very briefly the word anthropology. Okay. And that is a siren call for me, because my major is anthropology and linguistics. Oh. So that's those are my two loves in university. So clearly you love world building. So I'm curious.
Yeah. I used to volunteer with World Building Magazine. I used to run it for 2 years. So
okay.
Yeah.
So are those two things connected? The anthropological, well, one, you only mentioned anthropology once, so let me not jump the gun. But one, is that something you're interested in? And two, does it inform your love of world building?
Yeah, definitely. I am like an armchair anthropologist, so like very on the fly, but I do know how important it is to understand the way people interact with the world and the way they move across it. And anthropology is it's a lot of things. It's hard to nail down, but I think the way that people interact with the map is an important part of the map. Like, you know, there's a ruined city here. Okay, why? You know, did people abandon it? Was there a plague? Was there like this massive fire? Did the economy crash? Like, there's a lot of reasons that could happen, and it might not all be represented on the map, but I think those are all interesting questions for the story, especially. And that's kind of like why I'm so interested in map design is because in my opinion, it is so intrinsically connected to the story that you're telling. And you know, it can be more or less connected, but I think it always has the opportunity to tell the story that you're telling in a different way, to reinforce the story that you're telling, and maybe like even to contradict it. Like, you know, you could go deep and say like this map was made by the people who don't want to admit there's a problem that your main character is facing in the story. And how do you like annotate it or like signal to the reader like there's a disconnect here? I think there's a lot of just like really interesting things based on the way people use the map, the way they've historically moved throughout that world. Yeah, so like armchair anthropologist, but like a lot of those studies can apply here.
Oh, they can. Every time I get a book, I'm like, I look at the map and I'm so intrigued by it. It's my little anthropology brain going crazy. But I did want to ask you, PL, do you have this similar experience with maps and anthropology and world building?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, our part of my fascination with maps is that I mean, it's the first thing I look to in a fantasy book. If the fantasy book has some kind of compendium, maps, family trees, glossary, those are the things that I'm drawn to because I want to see the framework of your world. I want to see what you've done in terms of creating it and how authentic your world is based on those things. So I'm really drawn to those sorts of items in books and maps, especially. I literally, I'll read the story and I'll follow along with the journey. I'll follow along to see that the hero's gone from this place to this place to this place to that place. And then even if a place is referred to, but it hasn't been visited yet, and maybe it'll be visited later on in the series or a few books down the road, those are things that I look for, right? And I think my part of my fascination as well is, to see if, you have your own perception of what somewhere looks like if you've never been there. Like before I went to Scotland, I see pictures of the Highlands. I had this image in my head what the Highlands look like, but I was actually blown away by how much more vivid and amazing they were, of course, when I saw them. But at the same time, I've been to places where perhaps for whatever reason for me personally, they were underwhelming compared to what I heard of. But I always am looking for what is my version of, in my head, that place going to be compared to how the author describes it and puts down on the page what it looks like compared to the map. Because based on the map, I'm going to have a certain visualization, and then the author is going to describe it, and then you kind of put those together with your own perception, and that's the place, right? Like Mordor, right? What does Mordor look like? Well, if you have this, you might think about the movies, or the TV shows, but if you look at a map, if you look at Tolkien's maps, and you read the descriptions, like you get this thing in your head of what it looks like, right? And that's why I absolutely love the aspect of cartography in fantasy. It really brings things to life for me. So
yeah, and I feel like the more you get through the story, the more the map like makes sense. Like those points on it, those little symbols and stuff. It's like, oh, we're heading into like the haunted forest or whatever it is. Like this iconography, this little drawing on the side, like all of a sudden I'm scared of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and so that going back to that interactive aspect from Campfire, that sounds like something, because all fantasy readers, I have yet to meet a fantasy reader who doesn't love maps. All of us are like, yeah, maps, right? So I think that's such a great aspect to that platform. But I kind of want to circle a little bit back around to the what you mentioned earlier with World Building Magazine. So that, to my knowledge, from what I saw, is where you started doing reviews. And that's another aspect that we haven't even gotten to yet, which is what you do on Fan Fi Addict. So you said you ran World Building Magazine for 2 years. So I'm sure that you did more than just reviews in that capacity.
Yeah,
But
we didn't actually do much reviewing on the
okay.
magazine. That was more like educational stuff. So people
Okay.
would write articles about world building in different ways. One that sticks out to me when I think back to that time, we had somebody who wrote an article basically about world building in a tundra and about some of the more mundane reasons that was interesting. Like if you
Mm,
have, for example, a death in the tundra, you can't really bury that body. Like outside of maybe specific times of the year, there's permafrost in the ground. Like,
mm,
what are you going to do with it? What kind of culture emerges when you can't bury a body? And like little
mm,
simple things like that.
mm.
Um, just really interesting stuff. So like it was,
Yeah.
yeah, more along those lines of like how to world build with this situation, or
Pontificating on ideas.
yeah, basically. And sometimes we had like little short stories. I think toward the end of my time there, people did review stuff or like make recommendations, but it was
Mm,
on a much smaller scale than what we do over at Fan Fi Addict, which is like we are a review website. You come here basically to see the book reviews, and then
right,
we
right.
have like cover reveals or like some other stuff on the side.
Okay, so then what inspired you then to go from more like world building, talking about concepts, to then deciding to outright review things? What was that transition like for you?
I didn't have time, basically.
Okay.
So like the magazine, it was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed working with everybody who was there. I'm still in touch with some of them, but at the end of the day, like it takes up a lot of your time to manage all that stuff to produce. Like some of our issues were over 100 pages, which was genuinely insane. I don't know why we did that, but we just like kept pushing the envelope as far as we could. Um, so when it comes to like reviewing, I think I mentioned earlier, like I moved across the country last year, uh, stressful projects and all that kind of stuff. I only read like 2 books, and I was like, this is dumb. So it occurred to me like I think I read more if I'm not reading for myself and I'm instead reading to help an author, because I'm like, I might enjoy the story, but it's really easy to ignore something that I enjoy, no matter how much I enjoy it. But if I'm enjoying something that is going to help someone else, then that's like, we got to get it done. So I've read a lot more this year, which is not saying a ton. It's like, I think I'm at like 10 books now instead of 2, which woo. But for me, that's been a big increase, and it's been a lot of fun. It's been nice to be able to help other authors and make some of these connections because, I actually finished some books this year and I got to talk with those authors, and um, making connections, of course, with that review community has been really helpful. Just to like, some of them are authors as well, so I've been able to reach out to them to get advice, because this was Digital Extremities was the first book that I ever self-published, and so it was really helpful to kind of have a support group for that as well. Um, and yeah, just a lot of different reasons, kind of like trying to be more part of the community, trying to read more this year, and definitely going to continue doing all this next year as well.
Yeah, I mean, PL and I are, and you as well, are part of Before We Go as well. So, right, so Before We Go
Yeah.
blog. So a lot of us know what it's like, um, it's run by passion, essentially.
Yes.
A lot of these review websites, pretty much all of them are. Monetary, compensation. Who is she? We don't know her, right? So this is all done as like we all enjoy what we do, therefore we do it. But it does come with time constraints. How much can you read? How much can you review, right? So
Yep.
I've been guilty recently of really relying on other people's on the other people on the team at Before We Go to kind of steer that ship recently, because I haven't had time to write a review. My Goodreads has just been like review to come, review to come, review to come when I finish something, because it's just that season in my life right now. So I think that's a really relatable way to talk about that transition. Sometimes we love what we do, but time, reality happens. What's beautiful about it, though, is the ebb and flow of this community, right? So when I haven't been able to take such an active role Before We Go, other people have stepped up and done that, and covered and taken on that mantle. So I think that ebb and flow and the way we support each other really shines through when you're in that season in your life. So, but what I'm kind of curious as a fellow reviewer, though, what has changed about your experience of reading from reviewing in a more professional capacity? Like I said, monetary compensation, we don't know her, but it is a published review. So in that way, how have you felt that you have changed your reading style if you're going to be writing an official review about something?
I'll take notes along the way. Nothing crazy, but if I think of something, I will make some notes at the bottom of my document that will eventually become my review. Aside from that, not much has changed. I do try to think more than I used to about what does the author want to do with this book, and I'm sort of assuming a lot when I do that. But for example, I read I listened to, this is an audiobook. I listened to In the Garden of Monsters by Crystal King recently. I had a deadline for work, and I vastly underestimated how long it would take. And so I listened to that book almost entirely in one day. It was a 10-hour listen. So with that one, it's not the thing that I would naturally go to. That's somewhat my fault because I did not read the blurb or anything about it before I started listening to it. But it ended up being really good. And, even though it's not the thing that I would immediately pick up normally, it's like a historical fantasy romance kind of thing. I'm trying to get more into romance because I think I can, like, especially like as an author, learn a lot from it. And also just trying to be, like, in general more open to other genres that I wouldn't naturally go to. Anyway, all that to say, my initial reaction was like there were parts of it that really grated against me. And then the more that I listened to it, the more I thought about, what is the author's actually, like, their intent here? It's to tell the romance. Like, all the other stuff is a lot of set dressing, a lot of excuses to have like this retelling of a Greek Roman tale. And so when I I basically stopped thinking about what did I want it to be, and started thinking about, was it retelling that story in an interesting way? That I care about these characters at all? And the answer to those questions were yes. Like, I think at the end of the day, it's a really strong retelling of, like, the Hades and Persephone myth. And it's a little spoiled for me because I know how that myth ends and, like, their relationship. But that's okay because they weren't trying to, like, subvert it or reinvent the wheel. They were trying to tell it in an interesting way. And so I think that review is going to go up, like, next week or something. It's a glowing review because although there are things that I thought were somewhat repetitive, it did its job extremely well, and I like the characters, and I don't know what more you want from it.
Yeah, that objectivity is something I've learned a lot being a SPIFBO judge. Because being a SPIFBO judge, you know, within the team, we do what we can to get the books into the hands of someone who enjoys those tropes or that thing. But sometimes you get a book that is not your thing, but that's not the point. It's, does it do what it does well? Is it a good book? So that objectivity, that lesson in that and learning that continuously really resonates with me as a reviewer as well. But, you know, we've already gone over an hour. So at the end here, I do really want to circle back to your writing. So, yay. So Digital Extremities is now out.
Guys.
Yes. A collection of short stories, right? And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on at the end here, is looking into what you've published in your writing life so far. I know there was a large gap there where between when you first published and now when you're kind of coming back onto the scene. But everything you've published, as far as I've been able to find, is short story format, part of anthologies. So what is it about the short story format that sings to you? Why is it the thing that you typically decide to put out into the world?
Novels are exhausting. I don't know, PL. I don't know how you do it. I think it's just, I don't know. It's always felt more natural to me, and I like to spend a lot of time working on a story, and we'll go back and rewrite it so that the beginning reflects the end. I've noticed that I really enjoy cyclical stories. So like there's a lot of mirroring going on between different events. I enjoy having characters say, yeah, we'll do this thing later. And then that later never comes. So like, I don't know. I like working something through for a while. And with a short story, of course, that's a lot easier because there's just like less to digest and try and find interesting approaches to bring things through. There's also, like with a collection, a lot of freedom. I don't know if you've seen it, but one of my favorite examples of the way a short story collection can really play with form and format is Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, which has stories in first person, in third person. One character gets high and goes into second person. And there's one that's like mostly told through like news articles about stuff that's happening. And then chapter, or I guess story 12, is in PowerPoint format, which I just think is neat.
Yeah, what a nice switch up, right?
Yeah, and it's a super quick read. There's a lot of pages, but there's not a lot of text. And it's a really sweet story about like this daughter of a character that we met earlier in the collection who's like just working through some stuff. And this is the way she processes it.
I love that.
Yeah, it's like nothing in Digital Extremities ever goes that far. I play with like, there's one story in first person and the rest are all in third. And I'll play with time a little bit or like reference things from other stories a little bit, but it's fairly tame in comparison. But I always like that opportunity to play with the format where it makes sense to do so for the story. And in a short story collection with short stories, you can do that a lot easier. So there's just, I don't know, I've always enjoyed the format and the ways that it works. And I want to write novels, but they're hard.
They are quite difficult. I hear tell from people. But
we'll get there one day.
But short fiction, you know, I often, when I think of masters of short fiction, I think of Ken Liu, P. Jelly Clark. Those are the two names that really pop into my head. River Solomon, The Deep, is also fantastic.
Yep.
More novella territory, but still. And something that what I believe makes the masters of that craft is that slight touch of maybe we'll do this later, right? But it never comes, but it allows the reader to extend the story past what's on the pages. And that has to come with a very in-depth setting of place so that the reader can then imagine what it would be like, because you know what that place is like, right? So those two things, from my reader's perspective, have to come in tandem to make it work well. And it sounds like to me, Digital Extremities has both of those. So I'm so excited to read it now. You've completely sold me on it. I don't know.
Well, I guess my job's done. We can wrap this up.
All right, our relationship is over. It's done. That was the whole point, right?
Yeah, it's all downhill from here. But no, thank you. I appreciate that. That's one of my favorite things to do, actually, is to make it feel like more comes later, even if it doesn't. I'm trying to get better at not doing that, because I think historically I've done too much of it. But you know, it's a learning experience. I haven't. I think I'm a lot more proud of this collection than my previous one. It took a while to get here, but I think, you know, a lot of these stories are like, some of them 3 years in the making. I would work on them and come back to it later and rework things and rewrite stuff and, you know, trim out bits that just didn't need to be there, or add context to things that were a bit confusing, which is of course the normal process that you do when you write stuff. That's not unique to short stories or me, but you know, I think some of the original versions were maybe a little bit too much open-ended, and then in some ways I pared that back, but not too much.
Do you think, based on that, there could be a novel in your future?
There's definitely a novel I want to write, the one that I was struggling with last year. It is unrelated to this, I will say. It's a historical fantasy novel. Whether or not there is more to come with Digital Extremities, I am not yet ready to say.
Okay. All right. Leaving us on a cliffhanger. I like it.
I know how this works.
So I wanted to pass it over to PL, just because I feel like I've been asking so many questions. I just had so many follow-up things from the great things that you mentioned, Adam. But PL, if there was anything you wanted to ask that didn't come up earlier, just wanted to hand it over to you here.
No, it was fantastic. You did a great job, Taylor. You covered you know, pretty well everything that I want to ask. I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. And just, you know, I think I got a sense perhaps that Digital Extremities, there is, which always draws me in, a bit of darkness. I think it sounds like there's, just for me in the blurb, there's some darkness in there. So you know, is that true? Because that's something that, you know,
I've made some people cry.
Okay. All right. I'm in.
All right. I think it was a beta reader that sent me a message like something was sad or something, and it was a moment that I really wanted to be sad, so I just replied like, "Yes, get sad, like let's go."
That's funny.
Yeah, so I don't know. I got very excited of that, and then like, I don't know, a few hours later, I was like, maybe I shouldn't have been so excited that I made them sad. But
well, I mean, if that's the intended effect, then yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it worked.
Yeah. I think we often remember books that make us cry like that. So I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing. So I think it's okay to celebrate it.
Toward the end, I will say, there were points during the writing of this collection. I didn't always know it would be a collection. I was just writing stories in this setting. And then after I decided it would be a collection, I started putting things together. And I think it was at like, after I wrote the 5th story, I knew what the 6th was going to be. I was like, oh no, these are all so depressing. I need some happy endings. And so like, there were some stories that I wrote, and it's like, this one has to not be sad at the end.
Right.
I would leave myself notes like that.
Well, I feel like when you're dealing with environmental factors and the future right now, it's hard to balance that, right? Because
yeah, I mean,
it's looking so hot.
Yes, but I also, you know, The book is not a warning so much as it is a reflection on the fact that some things are not going well. And we all know that. But at the same time, there are some things that are going well. And whatever happens in the next 100 years, we're probably going to be, like, life will be different. Places will look different. There are parts of the world that will be very hard to live in. But that's kind of always been the case. Other parts will become easier to live in. And there's going to be massive amounts of difficulty for people who have to like uproot their lives and move to different places. Agriculture is going to shift dramatically. There's a lot of difficulty in that, but there's also a lot of opportunity in that. And part of the collection is sort of an acknowledgement that life kind of just goes on. The stories are not about any of this. The stories are about a loss in the family. They're about trying to pay rent. They're about trying to find a missing kid. Like, really stuff we deal with already. It just happens to be in the future.
Right. Bringing it down to the personal, right?
Yeah.
I think we can all connect to that. And, that's probably what brings the emotions out of people, is that personal connection, right? It just so happens to be in a setting that can heighten that. But that's what I think a lot of us look for when we read, is that connection.
I've always enjoyed science fiction and fantasy, but I've always felt like, the plots are always so epic. They can be sometimes hard to connect with. Or there's just like so many epic plots where it's like, I need one that's just kind of like some people trying to chill.
Yeah.
So,
well, the rise of cozy fantasy, right? That's a whole other thing we can go on, but I believe
really
that aspect as well.
Yeah, I mean, like there were parts of the story. I mean, this is not a cozy collection. I will say that right now. I accidentally told someone that, and they took it at face value and were surprised.
I see.
But there were parts of it that were inspired. Like, I mentioned I wanted some happy endings and some moments of joy. Those moments and those endings were kind of inspired in different ways by cozy sci-fi and cozy fantasy, where people are still dealing with problems, but it's on much more personal levels. It's on much more controlled levels in some ways. There's a little bit more whimsy to it sometimes. One of the stories, it doesn't matter a ton to the story, but there's one story where the main character has her own little publishing company, and she's like taking old books from floods of years past that aren't being redone in special edition and turning them into digital copies so that people can enjoy them. And just like, it does factor in, but not in a significant way. And the reason it exists is because I thought, wouldn't this be fun?
Yeah. And I feel like those, like, wouldn't this be fun aspects are what add the whimsy you're talking about. And I think that's something that we see so beautifully done in middle grade and is missing in a lot of adult fantasy and sci-fi. That, like, wouldn't this be fun? Little touch of whimsy.
Yeah.
But that's a whole, let me not keep you here for another hour talking about that aspect. But I want to second what PL said. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and joining us today.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me on. It's been a great time.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Before we leave, though, is there anything that you wanted to say as a sign-off, where people can find you, where they can go to get Digital Extremities, anything you've got in the works you'd like to kind of just let people know is coming, that kind of thing?
So the best place to find me, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Threads as at Adam C. Bassett. You can find me at adamcbassett.com. You can find my newsletter through there. I've got a Discord if you want to go there instead. Those are the best places to like keep up with what I'm doing. Digital Extremities is out now. You can get a physical copy, paperback. You can get digital copy. If you go to Campfire, actually, there's exclusive character art and full Like we have maps in the book at the top of each chapter that I made, but we have full color, full detailed versions on Campfire as well. I got more stuff coming soon. I can't talk a ton about it right now. One of them is a book about map design. The other I'll talk about soon. Okay. Lots going on.
Dangling that carrot. I love it.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely interested in learning a bit more about map design because, like I said, the anthropological heart of me is like, woo, whenever we talk about those things. So
yeah, I've actually got it in the hands right now of a local professor who studies both geology and history, and so I'm waiting for his initial feedback right now. I'm very excited to hear what he says.
What a cool intersection of interests, truly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hand the sign off now to PL. Where can people find you? What do you do in the bookish space? All that.
Normally finding me beside you on our channels, doing page touring, which is one of the major things I do in the space. My own channel, the Drunk Kingdom Saga 7847, where I do predominantly interviews as well, 6-element interviews, and book reviews and deep dives and things like that. The books, www.plstore.com, the Drunk Kingdom Saga, 4 books out now. Book 5, A Pack of Wolves, coming out in the spring of 2025. 7-book series. Before we go blog, of course, we're like Taylor. I'm an assistant editor, so shout out to Beth Tabler and the Before We Go blog crew. And I think that in terms of finding me, yeah. So X is Twitter, whatever you want to call it, is where I typically lurk. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as well, but Twitter is really where you'll find me hang out most of the time. So say hi.
Okay. So if you're watching this and you have found me through Adam and all of the different communities that he's in, my name is Taylor. My channel is Made Between the Pages. I do a lot of book reviews, discussion videos, life in Japan vlogs, combined with, reading vlogs. I do that combination quite often. I'm at Before We Go blog. I'm a Spiffbo judge. I also have a lot of things that I do in the space, but where you can find me is always page chewing, and all of my links to Twitter, Instagram, all those things are down below if you're interested. Also, all of Adam's links will be down below as well. Website, link to Digital Extremities, and any other links you'd like to provide me, Adam, I'll put them down there.
That's good.
For anyone watching this afterwards, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who joined us live during this as well, you are the people who make this what it is. We wouldn't do page chewing or wouldn't enjoy page chewing as much as we do without you. So thank you for being here. And we will look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. See you guys.